If you've been curious about what the heck all these hanging threads are about on folks' cross-stitch projects, don't worry, you've come to the right place. I'm gonna walk you through the parking method step by step, and you'll be an expert by the end of the video. Hey everyone, I'm Jackie from Adam Hart Cross Stitch, and this is the parking tutorial. By no means do I think parking is the best way to stitch cross stitch or the only way to stitch cross stitch. I think it is just such a fantastic option when it comes to stitching full coverage cross stitch charts. Now, what is full coverage? Well, it's just like it sounds. It's those cross stitch projects where every single square of the stitchable area is completely filled in. There's no fabric showing, there's no blank spots, it is all cross stitches. I personally love stitching full coverage charts. It is just a style that I completely gravitate towards. But the really easy thing to happen when you look at a full coverage cross stitch project, a lot of these tend to be pretty big, large projects. You're talking multiple pages, sometimes even upwards of like 30 to 40 pages can be normal. And that can get very overwhelming very quickly. It can be really difficult, at least for someone like me, to not kind of overthink, what symbol do I stitch next? What area do I focus on? Where do I want to start? It can just start to be a lot when it's that big. So what I personally really love about the parking method is it really breaks everything up into bite-sized pieces. You can really just turn your brain off and not have to think too hard about where you're going next. It's just kind of this great go with the flow style of stitching. Now, why the parking method gets its name is really all of these hanging threads are essentially threads that you're stitching with in one area, and then you go and you park the thread the next time you'll be working with that same color. And if that sounds confusing now, don't worry, it will all make sense once we get in the tutorial and you see it kind of happening in real time. So I've shared why I really personally love using the parking method, but let's talk about some of the cons. First and foremost, I think for some folks, having these threads hanging, either in the way or out of the way, just being there existing, that is enough to drive some folks nuts. And that's fine. Again, I don't think there's any claims that this is the best or only way to stitch full coverage cross stitch. It's just an option. So if you feel like these are going to drive you nuts, there's no need to force it. Other, I think, biggest complaint people have about the parking method is how it will make the back of your cross stitch a lot messier. And while I do think, yes, it can add some extra bulk, I really think that is way more dependent on the number of colors you have in any given area. Because I think no matter what, if you're using 20 different colors in one 10 by 10 block, it's going to kind of be bulky and messy no matter what, unless you're being really, really meticulous about how you're stitching. Through the magic of media, I'm gonna hopefully be able to show you the back of a different cross stitch project I worked on a few years ago. I think the back of this is relatively neat, and I did stitch this using the parking method. So what's the difference between that back and the back of another project I will show you through the magic of media and editing? Really, it's the number of colors. This project with the neater back, again, stitched using the parking method, only had maybe 30 colors tops throughout the whole chart, whereas this other one has over 80 colors, and there's a lot of color changes in small areas. And at the end of the day, I think everyone's threshold is going to be a little bit different when it comes to how messy or neat the back is. If you are someone who loves and enjoys stitching in a way that makes the back super, super neat and tidy, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think the flip side is also true. If you just want to stitch in a way that is relaxing and fun and you're not really thinking too much about the back, I think that's okay too. So there are a lot of different ways to stitch the parking method. Some people do this on the diagonal. Some people do something called royal rows. There's all these different types of methods and ways of doing it. I'm going to be walking you through just the way that I like to stitch the parking method, but I really just want to drive home the point that no matter which method you're using, the overall concept is the same, and there are no hard and fast rules here. My hope is that this tutorial can be a general starting and jumping off point for you, and that as you start to use this method, you really adjust it based based on your needs, your stitching style, and your preferences. The way I like to tackle full coverage charts is really focusing on one page at a time. I do like to start in the top left corner of a chart because that typically is going to be page 1. And from there, I essentially just start working down in columns. So I'll start with the very top left 10 by 10 grid in the chart, and then I will work down in 10 by 10 columns until I reach the bottom of that page. And then I move over to the next column, work down to the bottom of the page, so on and so forth. Most cross-stitch charts that are multiple pages are laid out from the top left to right, and then they move down row by row. And I just tend to kind of follow that same flow when I'm stitching full coverage. But again, that is total personal preference for me. You can adjust that based on whatever your own personal preference is. There is one big kind of caveat or concern when you are stitching the parking method in the style that I just described, which is basically working down in columns. And that is this issue of potential column lines forming and like kind of becoming visible through the fabric as you start to work through that pattern. So what's kind of happening there is if you are very strictly starting and then stopping new threads very harshly along those every 10 stitch lines, your tension between columns is not going to be consistent. And you're also going to have like a gap in coverage along the back because your threads aren't kind of moving seamlessly between those areas. It's just something worth pointing out, but there are a couple different ways to tackle it that are like very quick and easy fixes, and we will absolutely be covering those options when we get into the tutorial itself. In terms of project prep, when it comes to stitching full coverage charts, it is not something I will be going over in this video. I really just want to focus on the parking method itself. But a quick little rundown is I obviously love to use floss drops, so I will have my thread for this tutorial kind of prepped and ready to go on floss drops. But using floss drops is not a requirement of stitching the parking method. However you like to organize your embroidery floss will work perfectly fine. I'm going to be stitching on 16 count Aida for this tutorial. You can see here I am using pre-gridded fabric. I personally love to stitch on pre-gridded fabric. Like whenever it's an option, I will typically opt to use it, but it is absolutely not a requirement to use gridded fabric when you're stitching the parking method. I do feel like people think in general, like you need to grid your fabric to stitch the parking method. You really don't. I actually find gridded fabric to be way more useful in cases when I'm not stitching the parking method, like when I'm working on patterns where I'm jumping around all over the place and need to count a long distance. That's really where I actually find gridded fabric to be the most useful. In terms of this tutorial though, it offers such a great visual tool because the grids on the fabric will match up with what you're looking at on the pattern. But if you have specific questions about working with gridded fabric or how to grid your own fabric, I do have a separate video dedicated just to that. And because I'm going to be stitching on 16 count Aida for this video, I'm going to be using 2 strands of floss. But again, this is just a tutorial. So the size of the fabric you're using, the type of fabric you're using, the number of strands you're using, that is all going to be dependent on the chart you're working on, as well as your own personal preferences. I do want to quickly mention that when I was trying to learn about the parking method initially, I just could not get my brain wrapped around what was happening. And every time I was in a Facebook group or a Reddit thread or reading blog posts trying to understand what was going on with all these hanging threads, it really only made me more confused. And it really took sitting down and watching a detailed video tutorial to finally have this click and understand what was going on. So I'm just really hoping that I am able to show this in a way that if you're in the same boat that I was, you can watch this and just kind of finally have all the pieces fall into place. I'll be stitching this in real time. I'm gonna have the pattern right there on the screen the whole time so you can see exactly what is happening. And at least for me, I'm a visual learner. I feel like that is the key to just really understanding everything that seems confusing about this at first, because I promise It's actually very simple. As I work through the tutorial, I'm also going to try and address all of the most common questions I see come in when it comes to the parking method. So you'll see me kind of jump into some nuances when it comes to the pattern and decisions I'm making. And really that's just my attempt at getting through all of those common questions and like points of confusion that I see people having over and over again. And the last final note, this is just a fake chart I created for this tutorial. So yes, those are my beautiful little doggies in the picture, but that is why I'm going to be able to show you all of the detail within the pattern itself as we go through the tutorial. So I just point that out. I don't want anyone to think that I am sharing that much detail of someone else's pattern in the tutorial. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start stitching. All right, so when I'm stitching full coverage, I always like to start in the top left corner of the pattern. Now you can absolutely adjust that and pick a different corner if something else works better for your stitching style. The concepts will basically be the same, but at least for me, I'm gonna just really be showing you the way that I generally like to stitch using the parking method. So I'm gonna be starting right here in this 10 by 10 grid. Now, depending on your design size, fabric count, and how much fabric allowance you've calculated for yourself, you would need to measure in to find out where your starting grid is going to be. I do have a whole separate video that talks all about how to find the starting point on your pattern, whether you're starting from the center or from the top, bottom, side, corner, wherever it is. So I'll definitely link to that video below if you're not sure quite how to start from one of the corners. So I have my starting point on my fabric. And now we can go ahead. We're going to look at page 1 of our chart. And this is just one of like 40 pages, which is really typical of some of these like pretty large full coverage designs. So like I mentioned in the intro, that can be really overwhelming when you're looking at a chart of that size and just trying to figure out what part you want to work on. And again, that's why I really kind of like this method of parking when I'm stitching full coverage, because it's really just breaking it down into all these little 10 by 10 grids. So it's like little bite-sized pieces one at a time. So here we're just focusing in really on that very top corner section of page 1. And really all we're going to be focusing on is our very first 10 by 10 grid. Again, this is the very top left corner of our chart. So this is the very first 10 by 10 grid across the whole thing. And then for me, I typically will just start with the very first stitch. So this stitch right here is going to be my starting stitch. Just going to mark my needle there so that I can remember which square I'm starting in. And now if I go ahead and I take a look at my symbol key, I know exactly which thread I need to pull. So I'm going to go ahead and get my needle all prepped with that color. And because I am doing this demo on 16 count Aida, I'm going to be using 2 strands of floss, but the number of strands of floss you use would really just be dependent on whichever count fabric you're using and how many squares you're stitching over. The really nice thing about using 2 strands is that I can use a loop start. All right, so again, we're just going to be focusing on stitching every instance of that first symbol as it appears in just this 10 by 10 block. So we're really just going to focus on this one block. So I've gone ahead and highlighted every instance of that symbol, and I'm going to go ahead and start my thread. Now again, because I'm using 2 strands, it's going to be really nice and easy for me to do a loop start. You can start the thread any way you like. The way you start your threads, the way you stop your threads. There's really no impact of using the parking method and needing to do it any certain way. So again, I'm just going to come through and stitch every instance of this symbol as it appears. All right, so now within this just small 10 by 10 section, I have every single instance of this first symbol is stitched. So now what I like to do is take a pause. I'm going to look back at my chart and I'm going to look in this 10 by 10 square just below. And I'm going to see if this same symbol I'm working on, if it appears anywhere else in the grid immediately below the one I just worked on. And we can see right away it appears, and it's actually in this very first stitch of the next 10 by 10 grid. So now this is where the parking aspect of this method comes in. So essentially what I want to do is I want to park my thread in the next instance of that symbol appearing. Now, the biggest trick to this whole thing is when we look at this stitch, there's 4 corners, right? You always want to park your thread in the same exact corner each and every time. That is the only way to not get confused about which parked thread belongs to which stitch. So for instance, you could park in the top left, the top right, bottom left, really any of those 4 corners. I think what makes the most sense is to always park in the corner where you tend to always start your stitches from. So for me, that's always the bottom left corner of the stitch. And if you were watching as I stitched this first 10 by 10 grid, you could see it, right? I always start the first half of my stitch in that bottom left corner. I bring it over the top right, and then I complete it on the opposite end. So for me, I always park my stitch in the bottom left-hand corner of where that thread is going. So I know that this very first stitch in this next 10 by 10 grid is where this color thread is going to appear again. So now I'm gonna park my thread, and I'm just going to bring my needle up again in the bottom left-hand corner of that stitch. And then I do take my needle off. That's technically optional depending on a few different things. But now I've just got this thread, it's hanging. And the concept being, I'm going to finish this whole 10 by 10 grid. And then when I start this grid below, I'm going to already have some threads ready to go. So I don't need to restart them. They're already here, ready for me to start stitching with. If it still feels confusing right now, I think just watching it a few times, it will really start to click. And I do also like to mark my pattern to let me know that I have a parked thread in that stitch. So I like to place a little triangle in the bottom left corner. And again, that's just my way of letting me know later on that there's a thread parked in the bottom left corner of that stitch. So now moving back up to the 10 by 10 grid that we're currently working on, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next symbol. And again, I just kind of like to work my way across in rows and then move my way down. So we can see this symbol is the one that appears next. So I'll go ahead, take a look at my symbol key, and then get my needle prepped with the next color floss we're going to be using. All right, so I've got my needle prepped and ready to go. So once again, I'm just going to start stitching every instance of this color as it appears in this 10 by 10 grid. Now, as we come down to this third row, I wanted to pause real quick and just walk you through how I handle it when a symbol, just like the one we're currently working on, carries over into the next 10 by 10 block over. So I mentioned earlier in the video that we would talk about how to avoid those column lines forming when you're stitching this style of the parking method. And basically this is how I do it. And I like this because it helps me from having to really think too hard about anything. But essentially, when I have a symbol that carries over a few stitches into the next grid, I go ahead and will just stitch that symbol as it carries over into the grid. Now, what I don't do is if there's a natural break, like these stitches over here, I'm not going to stitch those ones, but it's really where they just continue to go uninterrupted. And that is just a very natural and easy way to avoid those column lines because you're continuing some of those threads over into that next grid So you're not gonna have kind of a hard stopping point right there. There is other methods that some people like to do to keep from getting those harsh lines. One of them is to feather the edges. So essentially, instead of following this line right here very strictly, you kind of create a feathered pattern all along the edge that will also help avoid any like really harsh column lines forming. So that's definitely another option. But for this demo, again, I just wanted to focus really on the way I like to do it. So I will go ahead and finish stitching all the instances of this symbol, and you'll also see where I continue to carry over into the adjacent grid right here. Now, if I were doing this and say this color continued for many, many stitches over, I will usually just kind of move maybe 2 or 3 stitches in and then stop there. All right, so that's every instance of that color as it occurs in this 10 by 10 grid stitched. And you can see those few spots where it just kind of naturally carried over. So I didn't stop harshly at that line. I just kind of let the stitches continue as it kind of happened. And now, just like before, instead of tying off my thread, I want to now take a look down here and see, does this symbol appear in the grid below? And just like before, I can see it occurs right here at the top. So I'm going to find on my pattern the next place that symbol occurs, and then I'm going to find the corresponding spot on my fabric. And again, I'm going to go ahead and park my stitch. The key point being, I am once again parking in the bottom left-hand corner. And it's just so important that you're always parking in that same spot. That is what helps avoid any confusion later on when you get to a spot. You don't want to have any question if this thread belongs to this square or this one or this one or this one. You'll always know which one it belongs to if you're always parking in the same exact spot. And again, I'll go ahead and I just always like to mark my pattern so that I know I have a thread parked in that spot. And I mentioned the first time around that I do go ahead and remove my needle from these parked threads that I have. That is optional. You can technically leave the needles on if you want. I think the easiest way to do that is if you have, a needle minder nearby, you can leave your parked needles and just kind of pile them up on a needle minder. Now, again, this is completely up to personal preference. If I'm working on a chart where there's not a whole lot of color changes happening, I have left needles on my parked threads. Obviously, the big caveat, you will need to have a lot of needles on hand to do it that way. But when I have a pattern more similar to the one we're stitching right now, and there's a lot of different colors happening, I do just go ahead and remove the needles from the thread. The other really nice thing, and way you can use a needle minder though, is if you're finding these parked threads are getting in your way at all, you can kind of just wrap them around once or twice on a nearby needle minder, and that kind of helps keep them nice and just tucked a little bit out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and just continue stitching. Again, I'm going to be focusing just on this 10 by 10 grid, going symbol by symbol, stitching every instance of a symbol as it appears, and then parking my thread in the grid below in the next spot where that symbol is going to show up. Now, if you're getting to this point and you're feeling still pretty stressed out about these parked threads and not being able to tell which stitch they belong to, I'm going to show you one other option for parking your threads. I don't do it this way, but I get so many comments and I understand the appeal. Like, it definitely makes a lot of sense. So one other way you can do this is you can see this thread here. The next place that it appears in the grid below is right here. So one option, if you don't want to just leave your thread hanging there, like you feel like it's going to be confusing, you can make the first half of the stitch like that, and then park your thread in whichever, again, corner you would be coming up from to finish that stitch. So you could leave your thread parked like this. And then for some people, this just seems easier to know, like, okay, where that half stitch is placed, that's the stitch that this thread belongs to. So that's just another option. If, you're watching this and still feeling like keeping track of these threads is going to be really difficult. But I promise once we fill this in and then start picking up these parch threads to begin working on them, it really will start to make a lot more sense if you're still feeling confused. Now, once again, just like with this purple over here, we can see this symbol, it does carry over into this 10 by 10 block to the side. It's just one stitch. So again, I just like to stitch those when it occurs naturally. And that's, one, just kind of nice. And two, will help avoid those column lines for me. All right, so I just finished filling in all instances of this diamond symbol in our little 10 by 10 area up here. And now when I look at my pattern, I can see that this symbol does not appear anywhere in the 10 by 10 grid directly below the area we're working on. So this is an instance where I don't really have anywhere to park the thread, so I will go ahead and end the thread. Now, a few things to note. If maybe, let's say that symbol did appear maybe down here in this grid, if you're comfortable carrying that far, there's no rules against parking your thread down here. So again, it's always flexibility. You can adjust the method to whatever works for you. And for me personally, it kind of will depend on the fabric count I'm working on. If I'm working on a higher count fabric like 28 count and I'm stitching over one, I will almost always go ahead and carry down 2 squares below if it doesn't, appear somewhere up here. In this instance, stitching on 16 count, it would probably just kind of depend. If the symbol maybe occurred in the upper half of the square, I would probably carry it down. If it were any further, I might not. So I think everyone has their own viewpoint on what is too long of a ways to carry your threads. I don't think there's any right or wrong. I think that is 100% personal preference. Another option you would have is, especially when I'm on the very, very top row of my pattern, like we are here, if that symbol appeared somewhere right here or even right here, again, I would probably go ahead and just opt to park my thread in that spot. So again, no rules saying you can't park adjacent to you. It doesn't have to be below. The only thing I'll point out is if you were much further down in your pattern, if you're gonna park something to the side, just maybe take a quick look and make sure that that symbol doesn't appear right above it anywhere, because then you'll just kind of be defeating the purpose of parking if you're already starting a different strand over here. That might be too confusing to explain right now. So if it sounds confusing, just ignore me. But in this instance, this symbol does not appear anywhere else nearby. So I have nowhere to park my thread. So I'm going to go ahead and end my thread. Now you can do this any way you want. Again, just because you're using the parking method doesn't mean you need to use any special or different or unusual way of starting or stopping your threads as long as they are secured. You could flip over to the back, run your thread under some of your existing stitches. Because I'm stitching on Aida, my kind of go-to method is to just use a pin stitch. So I'm just going to place a pin stitch directly below the square I was just working in, and that is how I will secure this tail. And my pin stitch will be a little bit visible, but it will get covered when I place a full cross stitch in that spot. Now, if you're not familiar with pin stitches, I do have a video 100% dedicated to pin stitches. I love pin stitches. They are super, super secure. So I'm going to go ahead, trim that off. And you may have noticed as I've been stitching that I just will start with one nice long piece of thread each time. I'm really not focusing on how much thread I think I need. Again, that's just my personal preference when it comes to stitching, but I just want to point out, I will go ahead. This is a really nice long piece of floss. I'm going to save this. So I like to use floss drops. And what I like to do is I take my extra leftover floss. I will kind of place it in its own little place right here. And the next time that I have this symbol appear, I will more than likely just go ahead and grab this nice long piece of thread that I still have here off to the side. And that's what I'll start working with the next time around. And I just point that out because these are, I think, just the questions I see come up in videos over the years, especially when it comes to the parking method and just wanting to point out that I'm not wasting all that floss I trimmed off. I do save it and then I just kind of use it up as I go. And now moving on to our next symbol. Now with this number 4 symbol that we just did, this is just like the one before where there's really nowhere that symbol appears anywhere nearby. So I'm going to go ahead and have to end my thread again. So I'm going to really just do what I did last time and just place a little pin stitch right below. And again, I'm not wasting this nice long piece of floss. I'm going to put it right back on my floss drop. And floss drops are just what I like to use to stitch, but that's not a requirement of the parking method. You can use any way of organizing and sorting your floss that you like, whether it's bobbins, floss away bags, floss drops, whatever it is. And we can see as I come over this pin stitch I placed earlier with this new piece of thread, as soon as I fill in and complete my cross stitch in that spot, the pin stitch really does disappear. And with this symbol I just completed, as I look in this 10 by 10 grid below on my pattern, I'm not seeing any instance of that symbol, but I do see it appear right over here in this grid. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. You can bend and break any rules. Like, yes, technically we're moving down in our columns 1 10 by 10 grid at a time, but instead of tying off, my nice long piece of floss right now, if I can park it over here and it makes sense, I'm definitely gonna do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and park the thread over here because it's just so close by and it's gonna be so convenient later on when I get to that spot. And again, even though I'm not gonna be stitching over here for a really long time, it's not going to be confusing because I know exactly what color floss this is based on where it's parked on my fabric, because I just look at the corresponding spot on my pattern when I get to it. I have my pattern marked to know that there's a parked thread right there. And as long as I can look at the symbol, I can see the corresponding floss number. And that's, I think, one of the really nice things about the parking method. I think it looks confusing, but once you just kind of get started with it, it will really click, and it really is not all that confusing as I think it seems. All right, just 2 colors left to go for this first 10 by 10 grid. And again, this symbol we can't park, so I'm just going to place a pin stitch nearby to end that thread. And going in with our last color, go ahead and park this one in the grid below. So now we have our first 10 by 10 grid completely filled in. So now it's time for us to move down to the next 10 by 10 grid immediately below. Now, my hope is that this is where it can all just really click for anyone who is still confused. But to me, this is where like the beauty and the satisfaction of stitching the parking method really comes into play. So clearly I have all of these hanging threads down here. So let's just go ahead and start with the very first stitch in the 10 by 10 grid, which also happens to have a parked thread there. So remember, I know that it's this exact stitch that has a parked thread without even looking at my pattern yet, because I know I always park in the bottom left corner. So I can just look at my fabric, look at this very specific stitch here, and I know that this hanging thread corresponds to this specific stitch. So now when I reference that same exact spot on my pattern, it's confirmed by the little triangle that I use to mark my pattern. So that's like my nice little double check to confirm that yes, this parked thread is meant to be there. And then when I reference my symbol key, I know exactly which thread color this is because I look at my pattern, see the little arrow, and I can reference my symbol key to know exactly what thread color this is. And if it feels like I'm over explaining here, it's only because I get asked on probably every single video where I have these parked threads, how do I know which thread color is which? So I just want to clarify, I do not have every DMC color memorized just by sight alone. It's really truly just being able to look at the fabric, know which stitch this parked thread corresponds to, and then I reference the pattern. So I'm really hoping I'm able to show just how easy that is, because again, I feel like this is the part that really throws people off and makes it seem like this is super confusing, but it really isn't. I think it's just really hard for it to click at first without seeing a step-by-step like this, where you also have the pattern and the symbol key in view at the same time. So really, I'm just gonna continue stitching like we did earlier, but because I have a parked thread here, instead of needing to start a whole new strand, I just pick up my parked thread. I'll go ahead and thread it on my needle. And then I'm gonna continue to stitch in this 10 by 10 grid just like before. And yes, these parked threads can kind of get in the way. Again, that's where I find needle minders to come in handy. I will just kind of tuck them very lightly out of the way. So again, we're just gonna go ahead and start stitching every instance of this color as it appears in this small section here. And again, I just will kind of tuck these loose threads in the area I'm working on, kind of in and out of the way as I continue to move through this area. And if I'm bringing my needle up in a hole where there's a parked thread there, I find it very easy to navigate around that thread, and it's not any type of problem. I think that's another question I see come up quite often. So I find it very easy to just kind of bring my needle up adjacent to that thread hanging there, and I don't think is any problem. And then as I'm able to kind of move stuff out of the way, I will. And just to reiterate, if you're feeling like the threads being here and then being in the way is going to be a huge nuisance, that's totally fine. Like I don't think there's anyone claiming that this is the only way to stitch full coverage or the best way to stitch full coverage. It's all really personal preference. So if you feel like these threads would drive you nuts, probably might not be the best method for you to be using. I find it just really becomes like not a big deal pretty quickly. Like you get really used to it. And again, just like in the section above, if there is a symbol that just naturally continues a bit into the next column over, I do go ahead and just kind of let that continue on, and we'll just go ahead and stitch those. And at this point, my thread is starting to get pretty short. So just like if you were stitching normally, I'm going to go ahead and end this piece of floss. And remember, you can use any ending method you like. Because I'm stitching on Ada, my go-to tends to be a pin stitch. And this color does continue on, so I'm just going to load my needle up with the new piece of floss. So I'm just going to go ahead, start a new strand of floss, and just continue on with the stitching. And again, just like before, that's all instances of that color as it appears in this 10 by 10 block up here. So now I'm just going to look at my pattern and see if there's any place where I can park it down here. And there is. So I'm just going to count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The other nice thing I just want to point out, and this may apply to some people, some of you may not relate to this at all, but what I really also like about stitching the parking method like this is because I'm working in small sections at a time and then just parking my thread in a very adjacent spot, I feel like, at least for me, it helps me avoid counting errors because I'm not ever really moving all that far away from the section I'm working in. So I feel like for me personally, it helps me avoid making mistakes by miscounting. That doesn't mean it, that doesn't mean I never make a mistake stitching the parking method, but at least for me, I do feel like it cuts down on the amount of mistakes I make. So again, I'm just really moving through this grid just like we did in the first section, but if I have a parked thread, I'm just going to go ahead, load it up on my needle, and really just continue to move through this small section, getting it all filled in. Now, I do feel like one thing that, again, at least for me, makes a difference is when I stitch, I really like to use a stand. So you can see I have both of my hands free. I do feel like that helps a little bit with the parking method because you can kind of hold threads out of the way with one hand as you stitch with the other. So if you are someone who, either stitches in hand or just doesn't generally use any type of stand when you stitch, that could maybe have an impact on whether this method is going to be the best fit for you. So again, you can see as I'm able to kind of tuck these threads out of the way, I will do so. It really becomes like very natural. I do not find that the hanging threads feel like they're constantly in the way or messing me up. But again, I think that's going to be different for everyone. Now, just like before, this piece of floss is getting pretty short, so I'm going to go ahead and secure this tail, get it cut off, and then thread my needle with a new strand of that same color because it does continue on, and just continue stitching. And again, gonna just go ahead and park my thread and just continue on with the process. Now, with the symbol I just stitched, this is another really good example of where I might park outside of this column right here that I'm working in. So when I look in this 10 by 10 grid right here, immediately below the grid I'm stitching in, that symbol does not appear anywhere in here. But when I look right over here to the next column over, I see that that symbol does appear. So again, that's a good example of where I might park a stitch in the next column over. But before I do that, I want to first take a look at my pattern and check kind of the column as a whole, because I don't want to park my thread right here and then mess up any of the flow of the parking method when I start stitching in this column up here. Because remember, when I start stitching this column, I'm going to be starting all the way at the top. So I kind of take a look around, and once I do that, I notice pretty quickly that the first time the symbol appears is actually right up here. So again, this is really going to be up to your own personal discretion each and every time. But since up here is really close to my last stitch of that same exact color right here, this is where I would go ahead and just park the stitch over here. So it's going to be in this spot right here. And again, I would go ahead and mark my pattern just like I would with any other park stitch so that I know whenever I'm working on this section over here, you know, exactly what thread this is, what symbol it corresponds to. It's all really nice and noted for me in my pattern in a way that's very easy for me to understand. And I'm really not trying to walk you through all these things to make it more confusing than it needs to be, but I'm just really wanting to show you all of the little nuances when it comes to this, because I think kind of my overarching message at the end of the day is that this does not need to be super rigid, and you can adjust the parking method to suit your own style of stitching and what kind of makes sense for you and makes sense for your brain as you're working through your pattern. So back to the 10 by 10 grid that we're currently working on. So the next stitch that naturally occurs is this one right here. And you can see this is a spot where we don't have a parked thread currently. So again, going back to kind of stitching styles, you can do this however you like. When you get to a section where you don't have a parked thread, you can just go ahead, grab whichever floss color needs to go there, start a new strand and start stitching. The way I really like to do it is I tend to skip those at first. And what I like to do is actually just get all of my parked threads in this grid completed first. And then I come back to the top and I will start working my way across and then down, just like we did for the grid up here, adding in all the new floss colors that I need. But again, that is personal preference. I like to just get the parked threads completed first so that they're just out of the way. So I'll go ahead and skip that stitch for now and just move on to my next parked thread. And then this symbol specifically does not continue on anywhere else. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and end this thread, and it is still a really nice long piece of floss. So just like before, I'm going to take any excess that's left over and put it right back on my floss drop. So I'm really not wasting this floss. It will all get used up as I continue to move through the pattern. So again, I'm just gonna skip over to my next parked thread here. And I'll notice right away when I look at the pattern to see what instance of this symbol I need to stitch, we can see that this is a section where this color is a pretty good size block that moves pretty far into the next column over. So again, these are all the little nuances you can run into. For me, a section like this is where I would opt to kind of feather the section. So instead of just stitching all the way over pretty far into the next column, I'm going to go ahead and feather these stitches in. So it's kind of like stitching half of it now, and then the rest of it will be for when I'm working this column later on. Now, like I mentioned earlier, some people exclusively stitch the parking method by feathering the entire column edges. I really only do it when there are big blocks of color like this. And again, this is all going to be personal preference. So for me, this is the way that I would just opt to fill in this particular section. And this color, just like the one before, it finishes right here. There's no instances of this symbol down here. If I look at my pattern in the next column over, I can see this really picks back up just right here. So because that's not all that far to carry, again, my own personal threshold, I am going to go ahead and again, just park that stitch right there. And just because I have a thread of this color, so this is 310, it's parked right here. Say as I continue to move through this column here, this color very well may start maybe down here. So another question I get a lot is, can you have the same color parked in multiple different spots? And yes, of course you can. So this column here, I'm not going to work on for a really long time. I'm going to continue this column all the way down. My typical stopping point is the bottom of a page. So if black 310 starts up again down here or down here, I would absolutely just start a new strand of it. It really doesn't matter if you have the same color parked, all throughout your pattern. That's fine. Because again, it's just whenever you're in the specific section you're working on, if that thread is parked, you pick it up and start stitching with it. So on and so forth. So there's no harm in having this color parked here and then potentially starting a whole new strand of floss of the same color somewhere down here. So I feel like this is a very good natural stopping point. I really hope I was able to show this in a way that if you were confused, it just really helped the whole thing kind of click for you. And I did also obviously want to answer the most common questions I see come in all my videos when I'm stitching the parking method. And that's really what kind of all these little nuances were, is really just an attempt to answer all of those most common questions I see come in. And again, I'm really just showing you the way I kind of stitch the parking method. I follow the general method of working down in columns, and typically I'll work one column from the top down to the bottom of a page, and then I start the next one, work down to the bottom of a page, so on and so forth. And of course, I've kind of adjusted the style to do what works best in my brain, kind of naturally try to avoid any of those harsh column lines that could form, and really just stitch in a way that makes the most sense for me when I'm stitching on really large full coverage charts. I'm really hoping that this helped just kind of show how it breaks the whole thing up into bite-sized pieces. And I find it to just be a very satisfying way to stitch. And I personally find that it does help me cut down on any counting mistakes or counting errors. Like I mentioned in the intro to this video, I think one of the biggest comments people have is, how does stitching this way make the back look? So of course, I'm gonna go ahead and show you what the back of this is looking like. So I hope that's really nice and clear. And again, the amount with which this is neat or messy, I think really depends more so on how many colors you have in any given area, and of course, how much you're carrying your threads over. But as you have sections like this one here, where there are just a good amount of colors in a small area, yes, it may get a little bumpy, a little crowded. I don't find that to be anything that I think is going to be a problem. But again, everyone's thresholds is different for how messy or neat the back of their work is. All right, friends, how are we feeling? Is it finally clicked for you what the heck is going on with these threads? Or did I hope not, leave you more confused than you were before you started the video? If you do still have questions or something seems even more confusing than it did before, please do let me know in the comments below. I will do my best to answer any other questions that are out there. And if there's more you feel like you need to see when it comes to the parking method, maybe we'll do a follow-up with part 2. So just let me know what you need, what you want to see in the comments down below. Like I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, this is really just the way I typically stitch the parking method. There are so many different ways to do this. For example, I showed you working one 10 by 10 grid at a time. Lots of folks like to work in 20 by 20 grids or even 10 by 20 columns. So again, I just really hope you can feel like this is a jumping off point and that you can make tons of different adjustments and really make it work for you. Whether you came into this video a parking expert or a novice, I'm really hoping I was able to share some useful information for you. But I appreciate you all so much for being here, watching the video, maybe stitching along with me. If you like the video and want to help support my channel, if you could do all the good things, liking, commenting, and subscribing, it really does help to push me to continue making videos for you all. And of course, if you have any video requests, maybe a tutorial you want to see, some cross-stitch related questions, please go ahead, drop it in the comments down below. Once again, I'm Jackie from Adam Hart Cross Stitch. Thank you again so much for watching, and until next time, happy stitching.